Okay, so I'm going to talk today about consequences, about goals. In fact, the title is Adapting Our Goals. Just before I get into that, just a little bit of a prelude, I think, on where we're at generally in the program. So we've been talking so far in this program about ethics and politics in relation to the middle way, on sort of general conditions for ethics. So we've talked a bit about responsibility and about evil and about virtue in relation to the middle way. But we're now going to get into issues that might provoke disagreement, really. So we're getting into judgment, areas of more specific judgment of a moral and political kind. So where there are issues, there are likely to be disagreements. So I would expect that. So it's pretty central to how we approach things in relation to the middle way, to particularly highlight provisionality as central to the middle way approach. So provisionality as a way of handling disagreement is going to be vital here. Yeah? So it'll be an opportunity to practice provisionality in relation to your discussions of these things. So provisionality, you might want to refer back to the discussion we had about that several months ago now. But it involves considering alternative views as far as practicable, not just demonizing them, assuming that they're totally wrong, or appropriating them, assuming they're just like your view. And that's really allied to a practical question of where we get our confidence from. So the idea that confidence comes from our bodies rather than from being right, or being absolutely right. So we can be ready to adapt our views where appropriate because of confidence, not in spite of it. So if we can justify our view from experience and evidence and from reflection on our values, that should be something that we're able to be positively confident in, and at the same time able to adapt when we encounter new experiences that might lead us to change our minds. So you can always ask yourself, so I think in relation to controversial issues, if somebody disagrees with you, how big a context am I seeing this issue in? Can someone else help you to see it in a bigger context? But if you identify a mistake, then that doesn't mean you have to cave in. So that in middle way terms could easily be a flip. It could be a move to the opposite absolute position if you sort of suddenly cave in and take the opposite position. So it's better to reflect on the whole picture and adapt the position you started with. Okay, so that's the kind of approach really I want to take also in my presentations when I'm going to be talking about, first of all, approaching judgments, moral judgments and political judgments generally, and then some specific issues in later talks. So I'm not going to shrink from possibly controversial issues. At the same time, I don't want to be needlessly provocative. And I'm not going to pretend to be neutral. So I have views, but my view is the product of me trying to apply the middle way in my context. And that context is not exactly the same as yours, though I hope there's some overlap. The views that you arrive at will be the product of you working in your context to reach the most appropriate view based on the experience you've had. So that's very much how the middle way works in relation to these things, I think. So the outcome of that might be that two people might be sincerely applying the middle way, but still disagree on complex moral and political issues. So what's really important is how they disagree, rather than just the thing they disagree about. Okay, so that's just a prelude really for coming into this sort of area of discussion. So now I'm going to focus on the question of goals and consequences for the rest of this session. So I've got a bit of a PowerPoint I'm going to share with you. So the question of goals, really, goals are, broadly speaking, they're about desired future states. So when there are things we want to happen, you might have a goal of becoming a doctor or losing 10 pounds or whatever. Those kinds of goals involve beliefs of various kinds, whatever goals we may have. Broadly, I think of three kinds. So the beliefs about how things are. So there's always going to be a background to, you've got to assume things about the world when you decide what you want to happen in the world. There are also causal beliefs about how to make things happen. So, for example, what effects do vaccination have, or what effects do they not have? And there are also values. So values are desires that we might prioritize and justify and so on. So we have views about what sort of goals are good. Got to be good for a particular person or people in a particular way. Why is that most important? So who you prioritize in your goals, is it you, is it other people, whatever, is crucial to your values. So whatever the goals you're thinking about, whether they're long-term things and they are like what to do with your life, or whether they're short-term things or what you want to achieve by tomorrow, all of these things are going to be involved. Background beliefs, causal beliefs, and values. And all of these are prone to mistakes. We could be wrong about any of those. So I think adapting our goals and trying to be provisional about our goals involves thinking perhaps about how we could possibly be limited in any of these respects. So, for example, we could be deluded about how things are with another person, say. So we could assume because someone disagrees with us that they have a bad motive, say. And that's not taking into account how they are, just projecting something onto them. We could be wrong about causal relationships, perhaps because we've only had limited sources of information. So, for example, you can read one article which tells you, say, that vaccines cause autism without looking at any other sources and just believe that. And we could be wrong in our values in the sense that our values could be formed from too limited a standpoint. It could be based on how we feel at one point rather than a longer term or wider perspective. Perhaps we make a judgment at one point in the grip of strong emotions or compulsions, but we don't look at the wider picture. So hence, for example, the old adage, marry in haste, repent at leisure, for example. So things that we might repent of in the longer term, maybe values that are mistaken in it from a wider standpoint. So adapting our goals involves provisionality in all these respects, thinking about these different areas. But if we do realize that we might be mistaken, then it's still quite difficult to change our goals, and there's sort of resistance to changing our goals. And one of the major reasons for that is what's known as the sunk cost fallacy. So the tendency we have not to want to change our goals, because to do so would mean that we recognize we've wasted a lot of time and money pursuing a goal that's not going to work we've been, as the phrase has it, flogging a dead horse. And there's also a loss of face, of course, that we have to admit to other people that we haven't been pursuing the right goals. We have to admit all that if we change our minds. So that's the reason why people hang on to failing businesses, for example. And another major example that rears its head very much for me at the moment is Brexit, which seems to me to involve a lot of sunk costs for the current UK government. So if we pursue a goal regardless of the consequences, regardless of the wider picture, we can do so very narrowly without taking some of these things into account, and maybe not in an adaptable enough way. Okay, so that's a wider reflection on goals, and obviously goals are going to be part of our moral decision making, aren't they? But there's a whole approach to ethics which is built on this. And so I want to come back now to something I mentioned in the last presentation, where I mentioned there are 3 different approaches to ethics in general. So just to have a quick look back at that. So I mentioned the 3 ways of thinking about ethics. So there's virtue, which we discussed last time. There's consequentialism. So the idea that what's good depends on reaching good consequences, attaining good consequences. And the other approach, which I'll look at next time, is ethics based on principles, also known as deontology. So consequentialist ethics are ethics understood as good, is bringing about the best consequences. We try and be good by be right by thinking ahead about what's going to happen as a result of our actions and trying to make sure the best thing realistically happens. So consequentialists like to face up to the evidence and face up to all the indications of what will actually happen if they act in a particular way. And they're going to give that priority over principles that people might urge. So a classic example of where consequentialism differs from deontology, say, is the abortion debate, where the advantages of allowing abortion by law is very much that it leads to better consequences, whereas other people may object to abortion or the legalization of abortion on principle. Okay, so the classic moral theory that makes use of consequentialism is utilitarianism, which goes back to the 18th century philosophy, particularly of Jeremy Bentham is associated with it. It involves the idea of maximizing the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. So that's the kind of consequences, according to utilitarianism, you need to try and bring about, the ones that make more people happier in the end, often that lead to more pleasure and less pain. So Jeremy Bentham was so stuck on making efficient use of everything to bring about more pleasure and less pain that he applied this to his own body, which he had stuffed and preserved, and you can now see it as pictured here at the entrance of University College London. So he took utilitarianism to its logical conclusion, you could say. But utilitarianism, although as we'll see, it has some major drawbacks, or can have some major drawbacks, also does have some great advantages. It makes us look at consequences, makes us look at what's actually likely to happen. And scientific evidence, which it uses as the best indicator, particularly for our causal beliefs about what's really likely to happen. And to get the best idea of what's likely to happen, we need to look at a range of evidence, face up to what that evidence says, rather than just looking at what confirms our view. So if you take the example of vaccination, the advantages of having to think through the consequences in relation to the evidence will involve thinking, if you're considering getting vaccinated or not getting vaccinated for COVID, for example, well, what will be the consequences of getting vaccinated? against what will be the consequences of not getting vaccinated, because that's also a consequence to consider. In each case, there are beliefs about the world involved, there were causal beliefs involved, there were values involved. So how justified are those? And utilitarianism and consequentialism in general just makes you think it through systematically. Of course, that can be a highly rationalized process, but at an individual level, it might just be a prompt to you to think about it a bit more in a much more informal way. But utilitarianism is very often the best kind of default consensual approach that can be used by organizations and governments and so on, to take a load of evidence on a complicated issue and come up with the best results to help everybody as much as possible. So it has all those advantages for organizations as well as for individuals. But it can also obviously be disembodied, particularly when used by individuals, and impersonal. It leads you back onto sort of calculating what's going to happen, rather than really taking responsibility for it in a way that you might feel more fully. And particularly being aware of the limitations of your calculations. So I'm going to show you just a quick bit of video about a classic example of where utilitarianism can go wrong. And this is known as the Tanganyika Groundnut Scheme, which occurred in the 1940s, starting in 1947, I believe.
Nuts, peanuts, call them what you like. Small as they are, they've caused a rumpus that has now flared into a major political issue. Hotly debated in Parliament, the workings of the Groundnut Scheme were defended successfully by Food Minister John Strachey. Answering his many critics, he said that plenty had already been achieved and that the men dismissed, Mr. Rosa, pictured here, and Mr. Wakefield, no longer enjoyed his confidence. Peering behind the African curtain of secrecy, Pathé goes behind the scenes to Tanganyika, to the back of beyond, where over 2 years ago the first start was made. Facing the confident pioneers was a jungle, enough to daunt the courage of a Columbus. Battling against tremendous odds, the white men, helped by the natives, got down to the job. Each bit of equipment had to come from Britain. Each screw, each bolt traveled thousands of miles. Railway lines had to be laid. Local labor had to be taught. For this had been nothing, and everything takes time. Nature was reluctant to give up its grip. Men and machines had to fight to conquer, but conquer they did. After months of heartbreak and frustration came success, but only in small measure. The wilderness gave a harvest and the promise of better things to come. 100,000 acres had been cleared. Hundreds of thousands more were still just wilderness. The first crop, just over 2,000 tons, was valued at 85,000 pounds. This small return for a large outlay is the spark that has ignited the political battle. Criticisms of mismanagement have been widespread, allegations of inefficiency sweeping. But whether the Overseas Food Corporation is nuts or not, it's nuts that they turned out, and that's what they set out to do. The prize is rich. For success of the Groundnut Scheme could open up a new era in colonial development, an era that could mean prosperity for Britain and the world.
Okay, so the Tanganyika Groundnut Scheme seemed like it made sense in terms of the prior calculations. So the idea of it was to cultivate lots of peanuts, as we call them in Britain, for the British margarine market under the time of rationing in the late 1940s. And although that video tries to make some apologies for it, it is generally regarded now as an unmitigated disaster. So the decisions were made by looking narrowly at what seemed like a good idea from certain limited assumptions. But it completely ignored the environment of the area, the soil, which wasn't really suited to groundnuts, the climate, which was all against it, the communications, which made it difficult to get things in and to get things out, and the local culture. So it's just a classic example. There are many, many other examples of poorly conceived utilitarian decisions. Another one that springs to mind is the Three Gorges Dam in China. Utilitarianism and consequentialism in general can actually be a rationalization of poor decision making, ignoring key decisions because you're so fixated on particular goals, and particularly a lack of awareness of the limitations of our views. Okay, but positively, just to finish on a positive note, consequentialism can be used to stretch us. Yeah, so thinking in terms of consequences can be a tool of awareness. When it's disastrous, it's about only thinking what we assume to be valuable, but it can, on the whole, also help us to consider a whole range of issues. So you might reflect when you're considering consequences on things like this. So do my goals help to bring about good consequences? Which might be a bit wider than just good consequences for some particular person at some particular time. Have I taken into account the best evidence in the widest context possible when judging those consequences? And finally, are my goals adaptable? So once you've set up a goal based on the idea it leads to good consequences, it's very easy to get stuck in it. It's very easy to get subject to the sunk cost fallacy and unable to leave it. Okay. So I'm going to stop there. I've gone on perhaps a bit longer than I usually do, but anyway, let's hear back from you. So any thoughts on that or any questions or comments?
I just think of another potential drawback of consequentialism, in that human beings, if you like, are often seen as means to an end rather than as ends in themselves. Now, obviously that's helpful at times, but people's individual goals are often sacrificed for the greater good. I just thought that's something that maybe happens less in sort of principle-based ethics. Perhaps the optimum is somewhere between the two, but anyway, it's something that I think utilitarianism is often criticized for. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's where talk about human rights, which is a kind of principle approach to ethics, comes into its own. It makes us think about individuals and makes us think about what they need as individuals, rather than just making them part of a calculation. But yeah, there may be points. I don't think we can take either of those approaches to ethics as sacrosanct or ultimate, because there are points where, unfortunately, individual rights have to be overridden by some kind of greater good, but it's often way too easy to use that rationalization for overriding them. So that's where either of them can be prompts to really think about the impact and really think about the rights as well. Any other thoughts? Does this fit with the way that you tend to think about ethics, or have done so far?
Hi. So I was watching some commentary by Yuval Harari, I think the name is, on how we can reach in the world a situation between nations of not so much compromise, but harmony without uniformity. And he did mention the, you know, finding a middle way. It was very interesting. But the problem he thought could only be solved by trust. But that brings a whole heap of issues, because the normal military advisors would actually, and he gives some very good examples, I could circulate the link, of where the globe, we have to solve certain global issues globally through cooperation and through trust between nations or spokespeople for nations. But the military advisors, or the mistrust, and this happens in anywhere from Brexit to whatever decision making happens, is that if you don't trust the other person, I mean, you can be, trust can be treated as naivety and taken advantage of. And so suspicion arises, and this is where military advisors would come in and say, well, you know, they say that, but they could do this, or they could do something much worse. They could develop these weapons, for instance. And to be careful, we have to consider the worst that could happen. So you get this kind of, you never get this situation of real trust between nations or different groups within nations. And I'm not sure if that's addressing any of your specific points, but it just struck me today. It's quite important.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, trust is one of those things that connects very much to the right hemisphere, and the so is in contrast to, you know, utilitarianism very much depends on left hemisphere calculation, an abstracted way of thinking, and there are people who very much react against that, and suggests that it's necessarily evil, for example. But sometimes I think that kind of calculation is necessary. But at the same time, what it tends to ignore when it overrides too much is, trust is one of the major things, I think, because trust is very much about this sort of intuitive connection between individuals who are complex, and our ways of sizing up other people are largely unconscious and based on these complex interactions. Of course, it's part of the way society necessarily works, that we have to trust each other. So there are lots of examples of kind of utilitarian schemes that undermine trust by bureaucratizing things or being managerialist, for example. I mean, I can think of lots of examples from education where I used to work that some manager comes up with a great scheme for coming up with very detailed targeting for students, say, and which kind of attempts to it's too systematic, or it's too explicit, because there's a flexibility in relationships between teachers and students all the time, which means that those interactions allow the teacher to adapt to each student and their way of operating. So that there are always limits to how effectively you can bureaucratize. But the utilitarian schemas often don't take that into account when they've got this big scheme which seems to fit everything, rather like the Groundnut Scheme. But yeah, in the Groundnut Scheme, you could talk about the same thing, actually. So the relationships between, in this case, the colonizing British and the local people in Tanzania was part of the problem. They didn't have the trust of the local people. Any other thoughts?
It seems to me that it's perhaps a strategy that is particularly useful in groups or in organisations. I'm thinking, for example, with the NHS or any health service, where they have to make decisions about you know, funding. So do you give more money to sufferers of cancer, of say pancreatic cancer or lung cancer? Which one has a better rate of success? And you know, it seems very applicable in that sense, even though, again, you know, the individual, say the pancreatic sufferer who suffers at the fact, oh sorry, the other way around, lung cancer has a very low rate of success, so they might lose out in terms of funding. But you know, sometimes those difficult decisions in those organizations have to be made very pragmatically, and that consequentialist way of thinking seems pragmatic, maybe the right word. You know, not perfect, but you know, gets things done. Yeah.
But that would certainly be my view, that it's necessary in such circumstances. Yeah. So in the sort of hypothetical example where you've got 8 people who need a kidney but only 1 kidney, then somehow you've got to make a decision. And it's the same with you know, the work of NICE, for example, in the UK, of you know, deciding basically what to spend money on, what's the most efficient way of spending money on treatments that will help people. And in the course of that, you can't help everybody that wants help to the extent that they would like. So you have to be selective. And you can only really base that on evidence as well, of course, but you also have to have certain values that people will agree about, which is again where utilitarianism scores, because people can generally agree that we need to avoid pain and promote pleasure, but it's much harder to agree on the specific principles that many people bring to ethical debates from other directions. Okay, any other thoughts or questions?
I think the idea of the vaccination is perhaps an interesting one. I've just had my first vaccination, and my process was, it might stop me from getting the COVID, which if I get the COVID, I may well die. On the other hand, it might have a long-term effect that I don't know about and nobody can know about. It makes me ask the question, who do I trust? Do I trust the government? Absolutely not. At least not in a lot of ways. Do I trust the NHS? Do I trust science? And I think that basically it also comes to the argument that, quite apart from my personal things about whether I live or die, or whether my family wants me to or doesn't want me to, the argument for hospital beds is quite a powerful one. I actually don't want to end up taking up a hospital bed that I don't want, and is actually a bloody waste of time. Am I making myself clear here? Yeah. So the ramifications of the whole thing do actually go on to trust on quite a large scale. I'm not sorry I had the vaccination, and I hope that I'll have another one, and that maybe it will prevent me from coming to a life-threatening position that I clearly don't want. But it isn't as simple as just saying, I've been told I should have this, it's good for me, and I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
And I can't be absolutely sure that it will be good for me. I know a lot of people who wouldn't touch it.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the mistakes I think that utilitarians often make. So they've got a very worked out, rationalized scheme of why something would be good. But things like trust don't come into it, in that if somebody disagrees with that, then they're taken to be irrational, and they perhaps don't go through into the embodied situation of that person and why they're judging as they do. But of course, there can be more and less adequate types of utilitarianism and more and less adequate ways of applying it, and there can be more psychologically subtle approaches that are still broadly utilitarian, that try to take those sorts of things into account. Okay, Mark?
I'm wondering about individual and collective, but also bottom-up or top-down dimensions of utilitarianism. If it's bottom-up and a choice of individuals, then that might seem to allow for more trust and freedom in collectively contributing and choosing to do so towards what's best for all, and being provisional about which direction to go in that, rather than holding on to one's own prior goals and what seems beneficial to oneself. However, if it's top down, that, especially in more individualistic cultures like Anglo-American tradition, then trust becomes more of a problem, and there might be more resistance, or at least I feel that way. I listened to an interesting comparison that a woman who's living in China but was born in the US but is Chinese, and a popular media figure there in China now, was making this comparison and saying that the Chinese government benefits from a long tradition there of people being trained from childhood to be considerate of others and to act for the benefit of the larger good of family, but then beyond that, community, so that the government often can be very dictatorial, and yet it does have to respond if a large number of people speak out collectively against it. It's very dangerous for them to do so because they might be silenced. But on the other hand, when the Wuhan virus started, the government was covering it up at first and blaming the doctor, and so who was speaking out. And so the people, seemed to convince the government that it was acting wrongly in a utilitarian sense, and the government changed course and then went the opposite way and locked the city down and other cities down to prevent the spread of the virus, after admitting that it was a problem. So, and then many people were frustrated with that because it was a top-down utilitarian move that was very difficult, for people to be stuck in their homes for over a month. So it seems to me like China is an interesting example of where utilitarianism seems to work fairly well when the majority of people trust that the government leaders are wise enough and well-intentioned enough for the common good. But of course, in Hong Kong, there wasn't that perception, and there was a crackdown there because of that. So it's interesting to see how a more utilitarian top-down provisionality might work, especially if the government's willing to change course for the benefit of all. And how difficult it is for our culture to view that as a positive thing.
Yeah, those are all good examples. Yeah, and I mean, they relate to some of the things that I think we'll go on to discuss more in the politics section. So in 2 or 3 sessions time. Okay, perhaps we better stop there and move on to the groups. But so I'll stop recording now.